He's only was on 6 continents last year. Given his sort of world travels and his great knowledge, we are so lucky to have him here in Richmond, Virginia. So welcome and thank you, Dr. Lawson.
Now, just to introduce you, what they asked me to talk about is sort of the early John Marshall. What you usually get is John Marshall as Chief Justice. So I'm going to talk about a little bit how he got there. And I should say, in doing that if those of you who know John Marshall knows that he always deified George Washington. You said he was the link between Washington and Lincoln, and he was, but it was a link based on almost worship, in the sense that Lincoln had an incredibly venerated John Marshall, and John Marshall venerated George Washington. But it wasn't George Washington that launched Marshall's career as a justice, or before that in politics. Really, more than anybody else, it was John Adams. Now, that's a story I think is worth telling because it plays into the election of 1800, but it is a little broader than that, and it can make John Marshall's career and elevation seem more than simply, oh, he was a great lawyer, he's naturally going to become Chief Justice. No, there was a lot of chance and politics involved. So, let me explain. And it all goes back to France. The threat of France consumed the John Adams administration more than anything else from its very outset, because at the end of the Washington administration was beginning to be consumed by France. And what was consuming about it, I don't know where you can put it. What was consuming about France is that France was going through France had been our ally in the Revolutionary War, and we were duty-bound to them. But France was going through a tremendous revolution, a violent Republican revolution that split America. Because there were a lot of Republicans, Jefferson's party, back then, and a lot of Americans, as we'll see, including Matt Marshall, who admired France and admired the possible potential of French Revolution, but also many Americans, like Hamilton or Charles Cotchery Pinckney, were very much aligned to England and wished our old Revolutionary War adversary, we were closer to them. Not John Adams. John Adams he was an old revolutionary, and like all the old revolutionaries, he despised England and everything England stood for, because he had been one of those early revolutionaries, not like John Marshall, not like Alexander Hamilton, who came later to the game. Now, France and England were at war, and we were torn whether we should support, under the Washington administration, whether we should support our old Revolutionary War ally that we were duty-bound by treaty to support, and England, our old adversary, but our principal trading partner. And Washington wanted to go with neutrality. He wanted to stay out because he thought our country needed breathing space. And so he sent over John Jay for the Jay's Treaty. John Jay was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, sent over to work out a treaty which granted England almost everything it wanted, but allowed us to stay neutral. And it involved George Washington abrogating the treaty with France. Now, Republicans like Thomas Jefferson said, and those in the Senate said, you can't just abrogate a treaty. A treaty is ratified by the Senate. The Senate has to go along with abrogating a treaty. And Washington established the tradition is no. While it takes the Senate to make a treaty, a president alone can abrogate a treaty. Whether it's NATO today and it's Donald Trump, or if it's the trade deal NAFTA with Mexico, a president can unilaterally get rid of that. And Washington did with the treaty with the alliance with France. At least that's the theory. It's gone to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court has stepped out as a political issue in Goldwater versus Carter. But that was the position that Washington took. Now, what resulted was open warfare, in the sense that back then, America mostly lived on its own, but we did rely on foreign, and other than cotton, which we sent to Europe, other than cotton, our main export was food, because the Caribbean were all sugar plantations, and therefore they couldn't produce enough food to feed all their people and their slaves. And some of them were French, some of them were Spanish, and some were English. So you had very, very productive colonies, Some of the richest colonies of the world were Haiti, which was part of France, Jamaica, Barbados, and one of our main businesses was trading with those, taking food down there. And Pennsylvania, New Jersey, many other states would produce export food crops. And when we were caught in the middle between France, people know that roughly, they hear the story, that England and France were stopping our ships on the high seas and impressing our sailors to serve us. Well, why did we have so many ships on the high seas, and why were they in a position? Because the war between France and England were being fought over the Caribbean, because those were the most valuable islands. And our ships were providing the key food, and so our ships were being stopped going into the Caribbean by both the French and the British. And it was caught in the middle of it. And the Republicans under Jefferson tended to favor the French, based on our treaty and based on the ideas moving toward Republican rule, while the Federalists, led by Alexander Hamilton, mostly favored the British. So Adams gets elected president, not Hamilton. And Adams is thrown in the middle of it, and he doesn't like the British, but he also doesn't really like the French. Well, you know the old story about John Adams. He didn't like anybody, and nobody liked him. The only person who liked him was his wife, Abigail, and everybody loved Abigail, and nobody could figure out how she could put up with the man. And so he had sort of a chip on his shoulders to both. That's where Marshall, I just go over that because that's where Marshall's going to play a key role, because he too is somewhat neutral on this battle. He's not like John Jay. He's not like Alexander Hamilton. He's not in bed with the British, but he's not as much in bed with the French as Jefferson. And so that's why Marshall was so appealing to Adams. Now, Adams began his administration. Back then, you were elected president. It was 6 months before you took office. And those 6 months were a disaster for relations with France and England. There we had Jay's Treaty. The French were stopping our ships on the high seas, hundreds and hundreds of ships. Tensions was growing. And so Adams, 2 months after he takes office, makes a bellicose address to Congress, urging Americans to prepare for war. Prepare for a war with France, which is what the Federalists wanted. The Federalists wanted us to link with England and break with France. But Adams, being the moderate that he always was, even though he gave a very bellicose talk, it was very anti-French, a very tough talk, he reiterated his determination. He wanted to send a peace mission to France. Now, tensions had been raised because in retaliation for Jay's Treaty, France had refused to accept the person chosen as ambassador. Chosen by Washington, but with Adams was going to be president, with Adams' consent, and that was Charles Coatsworthy Pinckney, who his brother, Thomas Pinckney, had been Adams' running mate for president. But you know, back then, because the election was so close, Jefferson ended up getting the job, coming in ahead of Thomas Pinckney. So sending over Charles Coatsworthy Pinckney, who was very suspicious of the French and very pro-British. The French would not accept him. So he gives his strong talk for war, but he cautions that I'm going to try one more chance for peace. Well, the reaction to this speech was as expected, went right down upon party lines. The Federalists were pleased that he was so tough, that this was such a tough speech. But they didn't like the part about one more time for peace. And the Republicans, led by Thomas Jefferson, of course, who was vice president at this time, were just the opposite. They hated the speech. They thought it was unnecessarily militant, but they liked the fact that he was offering one more chance for peace by sending over a peace party. So who would he send? What he wanted to send, we know from his letters, was a bipartisan committee. But as he told Jefferson, I'm never going to get this by the Federalists in Congress. They will not buy a bipartisan. I want to send one Republican and 2 Federalists. And he talked with Jefferson about it. But he knew he couldn't pull it off. So who was he going to send for this 3-member commission? He's going as far as he possibly goes. He's sending Charles Coatsworthy Pinckney back. He thought that would be, the Federalists would like that, standing up for that. So he was going back, and who else? Well, one person he chose was Elderbridge Gerry, who was a rare thing in that time, a true independent. He'd been at the Constitutional Convention. He was close friends with John Adams. He was from Massachusetts. He would later be governor of Massachusetts. He would be quite often governor of Massachusetts. He was a leading figure, but he was a true independent. So he could sneak that one by. And for his last member, he picked John Marshall. Now, there's an interesting pick. It served a variety of at that time, very few people. Elderber's Jerry was one of the most famous people in America. He'd been a leading figure during the ratification of the Constitution, against it. He'd been at the Constitutional Convention. He knew everybody. He was very well connected. And of course, Charles Coatsworthy Pinckney, who had been a leading general during the Revolutionary War, was a larger-than-life figure. Then you add John Marshall. John Marshall, at that time, he had been a delegate. He'd been in the House of Delegates here, the state government. He was young. He'd read the law under George Wythe. Washington had met him somewhat, had known him a little bit at this point. He had offered him, indeed, he had moved so far forward that Washington, when he lost his attorney general, had offered the attorney generalship to him. He was a Virginian, but he was not and Virginia was a state that had already been taken over by the Jeffersonians and Republicans. The Republicans were in strong control of this state. So it would be a reach out to Virginia, and Marshall was a true moderate. He had been at the Virginia ratifying convention, and he had been a leader of the pro-federalist, the forces in favor of ratification, and that's where he got to know Washington a lot better. And then, as I said, he'd been offered to be Attorney General and offered a seat on the Supreme Court, I believe, by Washington. He hadn't taken that. He'd stayed with the practice. He'd been in the House of Burgesses. And so Adams picked him balanced. You had one from the South, one from the middle states, if you call Virginia that, one from New England. So they go over but he was definitely the least well-known of the group. But he was a moderate, and it gave a moderate cast. It's not picking Hamilton to go. It's not picking John Jay. When they got there, famously, you all know what happened. They refused to receive him again without giving a bribe, without giving a tribute, without making a payment to the French government in return for receiving them. Well, they were outraged and marched out, as they famously said, millions for defense and not 1 pence for tribute. And they came back, and when that reason for it failing, Adams became a hero. They were lionized. Marshall became larger than life. They all became heroes from this moment where they called the XYZ affair, because Adams did not want to name the names of the 3 French ministers who had demanded a bribe, so he diplomatically called them Monsieur X, Monsieur Y, and Monsieur Z. And so it became the XYZ affair, which is one reason why, if you have an index to a book on American history, you actually have something in the X column. You don't have that. You don't go immediately jump over to Y in the index. At least that's the only time I've ever had an X in a word named X. Now, with this, rumors spread of an imminent invasion from France, that France would assemble a slave army in Haiti and march and roll up the Americas. That was a constant fear, because that's what revolutionary France was doing in Europe. They were marching into the Netherlands, they were marching into northern Italy, they were marching into what's now Western Germany, taking over the lands near them and bringing Republican rule to those places. That was the fear. And so, in response to that, the Federalists in Congress addressed this issue by passing legislation that triples the size of the regular army, from 4,000 soldiers to 15,000. And instead of all being stationed on the frontier to defend the frontier from the Native Americans and to push back the Native Americans, basically conquer the West, this additional army, as it was officially called, was placed in the East Coast, right in the East Coast, ostensibly to protect against a French invasion. But the Republicans thought that could be used to enforce martial law or take over and maintain their leadership. That led, the Republicans saw it as a direct affront to states' rights. To pay for that army and to pay for a navy, Adams vastly expanded the navy, made Old Ironsides, USS Constitution was built for this purpose. He needed money, and he imposed heavy war taxes on Americans. the highest taxes they'd ever seen, direct taxes right on the American people. Carriage taxes, window taxes, a whole variety of different taxes where he got the money to pay for this war. Now, after debating in 1798, the year of the election, the years of the next election, the election for Congress, midterm elections, after debating whether to declare outright war, the Congress settled for a half measure. Instead of declaring war on France, they authorized the interception of French ships on the high seas, called the quasi-war, allowing a Q in your index. There are some other Qs, but this is one of the more prominent ones. So that led to the quasi-war and resulted in naval battles in 1799 and 1780. This quasi-war would consume Marshall. Now, finally, in that year, to complement these bellicose measures, these aggressive measures internationally, they added measures on the home front to protect national security on the home front. So in 1798, the High Federalists pushed through Congress, and Adams signed the Naturalization, the Alien, and the Sedition Act. These laws raised the bars for citizenship, authorized the deportation of foreigners, even if they were, by that time, naturalized citizens, and outlawed false and malicious criticism of the government by the press or other individuals, including of the president. Not the vice president, though. You could criticize Vice President Jefferson, but you couldn't criticize President Adams. Presiding over the Senate when they passed, Jefferson strenuously objected to these acts, both in public and in private. He wrote the resolution that Kentucky would pass, declaring them unconstitutional. Madison wrote the one that Virginia would pass. Saw them as extreme encroachments in liberty, as did Republicans generally. Now, at first, as with any rush toward war, these measures proved popular with the frightened public, and Federalists rode them and America's fears of France to an amazing victory, the biggest victory they ever had in the 1798 congressional midterm elections. And with the hero of the XYZ affair right here in Virginia, John Marshall used that to gain election to the House of Representatives, which shocked everyone. This was a Republican seat. This was Republican Virginia. But because of his fame, his association with the XYZ affair, he was elected over John Clumpton, I think is how his name is pronounced. He had been the congressman before. After Marshall left, he would be the congressman again up until his death in 1816. And when Madison resigned in the midterm, we'll get to that, to become Secretary of State, another Republican, Littleton Tazewell, who later becomes, I think, a governor and a senator from this state, he's elected. So it is a solidly Republican seat. But because of this war surge, he wins. Well, it's not going to last long. The soaring national debt, the realization that France was never going to invade the United States, the heavy-handed way that the Alien and Sedition Acts were imposed turned the people away, so that a few years, just like happened with the Iraq War here in our lifetime, everyone seemed to support it at first, and everything was rallied together, but within a year or two, everybody began scratching their heads and saying, this isn't very smart. And it ended up turning people on the president. Well, that's what happened here. Now, Marshall saw this coming, especially because he lived in Virginia, which was the first to flip back. It never really had gone over. Republicans attacked on the Adams administration took their toll as the public realized the folly of a lot of what Adams had done. But in many cases, Adams was saying, it wasn't me. This stuff was foisted upon me by Hamilton and the High Federalists. So rather than diffuse the party differences, they only became greater. And here is where Marshall becomes critical. And this is the Marshall that ends up getting him to be Chief Justice of the Supreme Court and Secretary of State. He took always, coming from Virginia, knowing the tone here, he always took a measured tone on all these measures. I'll give 3 examples. I could give dozens, but we only have so much time, and I'm standing between you and your wine. The French Revolution. Let me read a couple of things he said about the French Revolution during this time. That revolution, which has been the admiration, the wonder, and the terror of the civilized world, had its commencement being viewed in America with the deepest interest. Notice what he says. the admiration, which was what Jefferson would have said, the terror is what Hamilton said, he sends them all. He goes on, so he talks about the French Revolution that way. He also wrote, there seemed to be something infectious, he's talking about the French Revolution, in the example of a powerful, enlightened nation verging toward democracy. So that would be one example. He took a middle road on the French Revolution. That's why he perhaps worked on the XYZ affair. Second, the Duane affair. Duane was the editor of the Aurora, and in conjunction with the Alien and the Sedition Acts, Duane was ordered to come before the U.S. Senate and explain his Republican views and his activities. Well, Duane disappears. He refuses to show up to the Senate. This becomes a mild crisis. And Marshall says, he shouldn't come. We shouldn't be able to call him. He said, questions of privilege are delicate in their nature and such as are most apt to interest the public mind against those who exercise the power of punishing for its breach. Notice the measured tone he's taking. The Federalist Senate is taking a high hand. Duane's got to come in. We got to send out troops. We got to capture him. Nobody could find him. He was well hidden away. And he says, this is a mistake. We shouldn't get into this mess. Questions of privilege, that is, I have the privilege of calling Duane, are delicate in their nature and are such as are most apt to interest the public mind against those who seem to be exercising the power of punishing for its breach. Second example, taking a moderate position on this, which bothered Adams as well. And it was an example of the High Senate. The third example would be his reaction to the Ross Bill. The Ross Bill was put forth in the Senate in 1800 because by Senator James Ross of Pennsylvania, who realized that Pennsylvania was going to be a split state and this election was going to be close. And so he tried to drive through Congress a peculiar bill that interprets there's a provision of the Constitution that calls for the counting of electoral votes. And that says that the votes shall be counted, the vice president shall count the votes in the presence of Congress. What does this mean? And so what the Ross was trying to do, and then, of course, if there's a tie or if nobody wins, it's the House that gets to pick the president. So what Ross wanted to do is says, I want to give life to that word count. I want to say that the Congress assembled counts the votes. It's not what it says. It doesn't say, you can correct me on this, but it doesn't say that Congress shall count the votes. It just says, and the votes shall be counted. So this law says it's Congress that gets to count the votes, and we get to determine whether any of the votes are valid. And we can throw out any votes we want. Well, he knew it'd be a Federalist Congress doing the counting because it's the old Congress. And Marshall stood against this. He said, this is a rank political enterprise. He says, and anyway, it takes away the power of the House because the House is supposed to decide who's president, but now you're letting Congress do it because they can just say that those votes don't count. And if they say that any votes don't count, the Ross Bill says that the members of that state in Congress, members of Congress from that state, shall pick the electors from that state. Each state has one member for each congressman and one member for each Senate. They each get to pick one. So that would turn over the picking of electors to the members of Congress, including the Senate. Now, Sedgwick tried to assuade Marshall and get him to pass the House. And this is one of my favorite episodes with Marshall, and this is my third one. I know I'm running along. He wrote a letter. Marshall led the opposition to the House approving, that passes the Senate, House approving this bill. Remember, the House is controlled by Federalists too, and they should want this control. But Marshall knew that it gave up power to the Senate because the Senate's not supposed to be involved in this process, at least the way we use it now. So Sedgwick wrote, on this question, I had a long conversation with Marshall, and he finally confessed himself, for there is no more candid man on earth, to be convinced. He then resorted to another ground of opposition, that he convinced it was constitutional. He then resorted to another ground of opposition. Although the power was not undelegable, he thought, by its nature, it is too delicate to be delegated. That is, this is too much a political question. It allows Congress basically to pick the president. And even if you might sandwich it into the Constitution, which at first he said it was unconstitutional, that's why I opposed it. He says, this is not the way it was designed. You're going to end up with a place where the Congress picks the president, like you have in parliamentary democracies. And that's, well, his word was too delicate. And then privately, and I love this line, Sedgwick, who's a leading, a very powerful politician and Speaker of the House, he says that, and I don't know whether you were exactly what he used, but the way it gets translated is that dang man reads the Constitution like it is a criminal statute. That is, a criminal statute you read very narrowly, where he wants to read the Congress broadly to authorize anything the Federalists wanted to do it. So that dang man, he was just a congressman then, reads the Constitution like a criminal statute. That is a very literal attempt. So what Marshall does is he offers an alternative and much less draconian bill in the House of Representatives. He leads the House his way, and the House passes his bill, the Senate passes its very powerful Ross bill, and they can never agree and compromise. Marshall wrote of his effort in this matter, "Let me do what I will. I am sure that the Republicans will abuse me for it, and therefore I need only to try to satisfy myself." Well, that really is a great example of how Marshall became a leading moderate Federalist. Sedgwick would later complain that, he's still in the House now, not that much later, this is still before the election, that the House has not passed any of these hard Federalist legislation that he wanted to pass. And he said he attributed it to what he called, and I'm quoting here, the real feebleness of the character of the House. And that's all because of John Marshall, he said. He is disposed on all popular subjects to feel the public pulse. Doubts suggested by him create in more feeble minds those which are irremovable. What he was trying to say is that Marshall, when he was in the House, had become such a leader, first term, of the moderates, that he would begin privately saying, I don't think this is too far for the public to go. They won't go this far. And the Federalists who wanted to be reelected all shifted around, and he undermined the Speaker. So he became a leader of the moderates in the House. They stood up to the high Federalists. And so in May of that year, in May of 1800, Adams becomes clear that he's in trouble on this re-election. He thought he was going to win the re-election initially. But back then, everybody didn't vote in November. States could settle their elections anytime they wanted to. The first states voted a year before November. First one's in December, in January, in February. It was sort of like our primaries, where you could watch the totals build. You know, you see Trump go up, and then you see maybe, well, yeah, I guess we never saw Jeb Bush go up, but Rubio go up, or Kasich go up. You know, see the votes go back and forth. You never quite know who's going to win. And so you saw the electoral votes building. And Adams had lost a couple key states that he thought he was going to win, like New York. And it began to look dicey, but he still had a chance. And so what he decides is, politically, he knows that people have turned against the bellicose measures of the high Federalists. So he tosses out. He had inherited a cabinet from Washington that he had kept, and they were all directly answerable and answering to Hamilton, and he fired them all. And he fired the War Secretary a couple days before he fired the Secretary of State, and he offered Marshall, come in. I need to show that I represent the whole country. You're a moderate from the South. Be my War Secretary. Then 2 days later, he fires the Secretary of State, and he turns and says, no, be my Secretary of State. So he gets picked up as Secretary of State in May, and now he's counseling how to deal with the French. Then he becomes involved in this quasi-war. And he says, I'm going to have to use more force. These French are stopping me. I'm going to have to use more force. I know I got to stop soon. And Marshall says you can't. You're limited by the proclamation. You can't use land forces. You can only use sea forces. And so they write a new declaration of war that would go further. And then word comes of a peace treaty with France. Comes back just in the nick of time that the French agreed to a peace treaty. And so Marshall had stepped him through. He's Secretary of State now. The administration goes on. Adams begins to do better. He almost wins. In fact, he goes to bed thinking he won. but then it turns out he hadn't gotten the news of South Carolina, and he'd lost in South Carolina. So Jefferson wins by a hair's breadth, and that leaves the 4 months for the Federalists to rule before Jefferson would take office. And during those 4 months, they're going to lose the House, they're going to lose the Senate, they're going to lose everything. And they try to batten down the hatches, do what they could, and among the steps they take is they convince Oliver Ellsworth, who's the old and feeble. He's not that old, but he's sickly. Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, to step down so that they can, during the lame duck, put in a new Chief Justice who will last a long time. They offer the job to John Jay. John Jay writes back, I don't know how healthy I am. I don't know how long I live. I'm governor of New York. I don't want to take it. And so then at the last minute, with a week left to go, he flips it to John Marshall. John Marshall was the sort of Federalist that Adams could tolerate. And that's how his political relationship as a moderate Federalist, which is not how exactly we remember him in the Chief Justice, but as a moderate Federalist, but a very principled one, a one who would stand his ground against any political odds, even his own party, even if it was John Alexander Hamilton, even if it was Theodore Sedgwick. That was the man, the type of character that Adams so admired, and so Adams makes him Chief Justice. The only ironic thing was that, remember the man he was offered to first, John Jay, who thought he was too old? He ends up living longer than John Marshall and would have served longer. But anyway, I've gone way too long. If you have questions, let's go downstairs or out back and grab some wine. And any questions you want to ask, I'd be happy to answer.